Welcome to TVBS Meeting Room, where we tackle global issues with a view from Taiwan. I'm your host, Wenqi Yu. French President Macron's recent visit to Beijing and his comments on Taiwan stirred up a global storm. In the meantime, Lu Shaye, the Chinese ambassador to France's comments on former Soviet countries also caused an international outcry. France's diplomacy and relationship with China is at the center of many conversations. So today, our guest, Professor Philippe Corre, is from Asia Society Policy Institute and ESSEC Business School in Paris. He's a French expert on China and Asia. Welcome, Philippe.
Hello.
All right. France-China relationship is in the news. What is the current view of China in France from the perspectives of the government, business community, and the general public?
So you have to take into account the fact that France is a leading member of the European Union. Everything that the French president says, and that French president in particular, has to be taken in the European context. As you see the French flag, when he speaks or when any minister speaks, there's also the European Union flag.
But it feels, can I, sorry to interrupt, and it feels like his comments more recently, especially on China and Taiwan, doesn't necessarily reflect that European Union view.
So what happened recently, Macron traveled to China, and he traveled alongside the president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, who happens to be German, but who is also the president of the executive body of the 27 members of the EU. So what happened is they met together beforehand in Paris, and then the next day they traveled. And the previous Friday, a few days before, she delivered a very tough speech on China, where she basically warned, Europeans about what's coming next. A very assertive power, a country that wants to change the international order, and that the Europeans need to be prepared for that, including economically, but also politically. So I think the two of them, between them, they were playing some kind of, good cop, bad cop game, you could say, although, politics is no longer a game, if it ever was. So I think, he probably, misspoke, especially in his interview towards the end of his visits. Especially when he said, if there was a war in Taiwan, it wouldn't be our war, something like that. But I think generally the visit actually matched the expectations of people who, like myself, have been following EU-China relations for a very long time. In the sense that, there's been 3 years of zero COVID policy. No official was able to travel to China. The embassies were closed as the whole country. Very few people were able to engage with the Chinese leadership. And then, things started to change last fall when Xi Jinping started traveling. So that led to a few visits, including the visit by the German chancellor back in November, as you remember, and Macron's visit in April.
So it sounds like that's a really interesting point. It sounds like European Union or European countries' general approach is when it comes to a collective voice on China, it tends to be tougher. But when it comes to more bilateral, perhaps for business trade and other interests, maybe the tone is different. Is that the correct understanding? Because what we see is when Germans talk to China, it feels the same as well. They're more careful, whereas when it's European Union speaking as a collective voice, it's slightly different.
So there have been several stages. You could say that when Xi Jinping visited the European Union headquarters in Brussels back in 2014, he actually gave face to the EU institutions. He recognized that the EU is no longer just a trade body, but also has some geopolitical role in the world. And it's very much what, Ursula von der Leyen have been saying, and Macron has been saying. Remember Macron was elected 6 years ago with a very pro-European mandate against very nationalist candidates, especially Marine Le Pen. This has been sort of confirmed by the facts that we are facing a war in Ukraine. Never forget that when you speak to Europeans, there's a war. Just two and a half hours flight from Paris, there's a war going on with people being tortured and so on. Yeah. And then, of course, there are many other problems in the world. But what I'm saying is the Europeans, of course, have different voices because that's what the Union is about. 27 countries. And then within this European Union, you have two strong members, pillars, you could say. Germany, which is by far, the largest economic powerhouse, and France, which is a diplomatic heavyweight, you could say, as a member of the P5, as the major country that recognized the PRC in 1964, and the Chinese keep reminding us this. But overall, the Germans are very pro-business. They've been investing a lot. They've been trading a lot with the Chinese. The German-Chinese trade balance is almost
even balanced. More. Yeah.
Now the French actually has a strong deficit, but they are focusing on other things.
Now, what about Taiwan? Do French people think much about Taiwan? What is their view of Taiwan in general? If you can help us understand.
Sure. So I used to live in Taiwan many years ago, and I was a Taiwan correspondent for the French media. At the time, people were wondering what on earth I would be doing in Taiwan. And it was probably not a full-time job, but I enjoyed it very much. Now we're in a very different situation. First of all, Taiwan has been in the news very often, and people know more about the Taiwan Strait situation. Also, Taiwanese diplomats have been much more visible than before. I mean, if you think about the Taiwan unofficial ambassador to Paris, he's been in the main news. He's been actually responding to interviews. This is a first. I don't think his predecessors ever did that. I mean, of course, because it's unofficial. But I think people are also willing to hear the Taiwanese voice and to hear both sides.
But is the general perception of Taiwan versus China, for example, in the United States, it's clearly, people favor Taiwan over China. Would you say the sentiment is more similar?
Oh, yes, of course. People would favor democracy, and they all realize Taiwan is a democracy. The sad story of Hong Kong, which I also covered as a journalist many years ago, which is fairly well known in France, strangely enough. You would think of the UK, of course, as the former colonial ruler, but actually the 1997 handover, all of these people still remember this. And they also saw what happened in 2019 and the fact, the one country, two systems arrangement never really worked. And they connect this to the Taiwan situation. And of course, the drills, the military exercises that took place last August, and again recently, all of this is sort of adding to the sort of
sympathy.
Sympathy, and the fact, generally China's reputation is not very good, really, in Europe and in France especially.
So I think these feelings are generally more positive to Taiwan right now. However, what is France's fundamental interest in Taiwan?
Well, I mean, France has companies, has citizens, has learners of Chinese language. There is a French institute in Taipei. And it's been going on for several decades. And especially with China closing. I mean, I studied Chinese back in the 80s in Taiwan. And you could say that now a number of French students have been returning to Taiwan because it's been difficult, especially until recently, to travel to Beijing or other cities. Apart from that, I mean, it's a relatively small country. French parliamentarians have been visiting Taipei en masse, and business is good. But it's a small market of 24 million people, as opposed to a 1.4 billion people market. So for companies, of course, there's an obvious decision to be made. But remember that Taiwanese business people were also investing a lot in the mainland for many years. It's been coming down, but this was not limited to foreign investors.
Of course. So, I think, France in general, or the West, right, has a more or less a similar approach, which is values are very much aligned with Taiwan's, and that is probably the fundamental interest in why they support Taiwan vocally. However, there's economic and trade, other interests. And France has a tradition of just being independent from the US and UK in general in terms of diplomacy. So what are the fundamental differences when it says, it's independent?
So, well, you have to go back to General de Gaulle, I guess, back after World War II, and also when he set up the current constitution, the Fifth Republic Constitution in 1958, where he really said that France needs to be different, to keep its autonomy. And you remember the debate around NATO. Well, France is a full member of NATO. And in fact, is probably the second most important member of NATO after the United States. People sometimes forget this. And France's military is, in Europe, by far the strongest. When you think about our troops deployed, across the world, from Africa to the Middle East to the South Pacific, previously in Afghanistan, in Lebanon, and so on and so forth. France has one of the largest maritime domains in the world, which is why we consider ourselves as an Indo-Pacific nation with territories in both the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. So that makes France a very special member of the international community and of the European Union. The other aspect I'd like to point out is the idea of European strategic autonomy, which has been very much in the news, which Macron has been pointing out, and which, of course, came back recently with that notorious interview he gave just a few weeks ago.
Just say it loud for our audience so they know exactly what he said.
So he said that France would not want to be caught in a war or in a conflict that is not ours. And by that, he meant that the Sino-American relationship, I don't think he mentioned Taiwan too clearly, but he answered a question about Taiwan. But generally, I think most Europeans, and not just in France, agree that we don't want to be caught in this new, call it as you like, a Cold War or whatever, or conflictual situation between the PRC and the US, because in many cases, the Europeans would want to continue to do business with both, and would want to enhance Europe's role as a third pole, if you want. If you agree with the idea of multipolarity, I served in the French government under Jacques Chirac, who invented this concept of multipolarity during the war in Iraq, as you may remember. France and Germany were both very much against the war in Iraq because they thought this was illegal and this would lead to a disaster, which it did. So this concept of European strategic autonomy means that we need to spend more on our own defense, on our own diplomacy, and we need to be prepared to deal with other poles, other continents, if you want. Now, of course, with Russia, it doesn't work because Russia has become an enemy of Europe. It has attacked Ukraine, which is not a member of the European Union, but which is a neighbor to the European Union. And that's why countries like Poland, the Czech Republic, Romania, the Baltic states have been very welcoming to millions of Ukrainian refugees.
Right. Well, in a recent op-ed for Nikkei Asia, you said Macron is perhaps EU's best bet to sway China on Ukraine, since you just talked about Ukraine. Why do you think China will be a key player in promoting peace in Ukraine? And why is it necessary to really get China on board to be almost like a peace broker in some way?
So quite a few analysts have been writing about this lately, including my colleague Gideon Rachman in the FT. Honestly, this war has been dragging on for 15 months now. Now, obviously, we all feel very bitter about the Putin-Xi Jinping meeting in February 2022, where, it's very hard to imagine they didn't talk about Ukraine and they didn't talk about what was coming up. You may recall that in April last year, just about a year ago, the Europeans were adamant that China needed to recognize the fact there was a war going on. And China tried to avoid that conversation. They
used the term special operations. They follow the Russian language. Yes.
Indeed. And that EU-China meeting a year ago was qualified as a summit of the deaf. People who basically spoke different languages. And the Chinese obviously had not started thinking about it in their ways of thinking, their internal meetings. They had not decided how to deal with a situation where their best friend, that's how President Xi calls Vladimir Putin, had engaged not in a special operation, but in a full blown war against its neighbor. And that's how most countries qualify it. Now, of course, a conflict that has been dragging on for 15 months and counting is also not helping China, really, in many ways. First of all, the Chinese have been very cautious in not trying to avoid the economic sanctions imposed on Russia. And secondly, diplomatically, now that the 20th Party Congress is over, now that the leadership is in full operational mode, you could say, in the CCP leadership, it appears that Xi and his colleagues are prepared to engage to play the role of a big power diplomatically. Now, with a war going on in Europe, they may very well say that it's not their war. This is the second time I use that expression, by the way. But in fact, it is their war because, first of all, they have this partnership with Putin. Secondly, the Belt and Road Initiative was meant to cross both Russia and Ukraine, and the many projects are actually at standstill. And thirdly, in the European Union, China's image already damaged by the 3-year pandemic and all the propaganda around it, and various other things.
All right, yeah, I think we want to focus on why do you think China should be the key player and will be the key player, right? And it will have to be through somehow, you said Macron, is probably EU's best bet to sway China on Ukraine. That's the connection I'm trying to make here.
Okay, so I think, China is the only possible country that can have an impact on Vladimir Putin. Russia has very much become a junior partner to China, economically, diplomatically. As you can see, Putin and Xi has met 40 times for the past 20 years. They speak regularly.
So do you think on that point, sorry to interrupt you, because I do want to draw this out. Do you think on that point, the Ukraine-Russia war almost in some way highlights the importance of China on the global stage? Because now, while the US-led Western ally is fighting against Russian invasion of Ukraine, but it seems like the ultimate sort of, the country that can really swing where the war is going is now China. In some way, China feels more powerful than anyone else right now.
Right. And I'm not sure the US is leading the war against Russia, to be honest. It's more complicated than that. It's the Europeans with support from the US, especially in armaments. But on the ground, there's no European soldiers. But right. China, yes, has to appear as a diplomatic deal breaker, if you want. I mean, remember the Iran-Saudi Arabia handshake, yes. which turned out to be more than a handshake, in fact, and other things that China has been trying to do over the past 6 months, welcoming President Lula of Brazil, talking to South Africans and to others. Xi Jinping wants to rally around China, some members of the global South, and against the West, of course.
Right.
Now, of course, in Europe, it's a complicated story because people feel affected by this war on a daily basis and feel that, if Russia is to win this war, it may very well attack members of the European Union. So, you can't really...
So there is a concern of the spillover and even further erosion into, I would say, other countries' sovereignty. And onto the next point, since China is showing off its diplomatic I would say might these days. And Chinese ambassador Lu Shaye to France, has been quite controversial more lately, and including, a past comment that Taiwanese people should be re-educated. And then, more recently, he also talked about how former Soviet countries were not real sovereign countries. So why do you think China sent a wolf warrior to France?
Well, he was in Canada before, so I'm sure the Canadians were happy to let him go. So we've had him for the past 3.5 years, and the rumor has it that that might be his final year. But watch this space, as they say. So he's been there. He's been extremely controversial and aggressive, especially on the media, and obviously not being sanctioned by anyone for this, except that he was summoned by the foreign ministry several times, especially for comments during the pandemic, when he actually criticized the French medical system for the elderly, which is very unusual for an ambassador under any circumstances. But now this story you just described about him, making obvious mistakes about the legality of certain states, including Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, all 3 members of the European Union, including others, like Ukraine, which has been a diplomatic partner to China for 31 years.
Yeah.
And Xi Jinping actually called President Zelensky, not just recently, and we might want to talk about that phone call, but also 3 weeks before the Russian invasion. He did call President Zelensky to congratulate him for 30 years of diplomatic relations with the PRC. Now, these are countries that are not just recognized by China, but with whom China has diplomatic relations. And this man was actually accusing them of not being full, recognized states.
And why do you think they allow him to behave that way? Because, if they didn't like it, they would have summoned him back, right? So what is China's diplomatic strategy?
Well, it's not for me to say why they allow him to be there. He's there, and obviously I don't know whether he's encouraged to speak like this. It certainly doesn't help Franco-Chinese relations, and he's not certainly, he doesn't have very high stocks in the French government.
So do you think, that's do you think it's almost in some way Beijing is also playing 2 sides, right? In some way they want to show that, they also want to stand up to especially the West. Do you think there's a possibility of that?
Yes, I think there is a possibility. And remember, there are a few of those so-called wolf warrior diplomats. and there was one as one of the spokespersons of Wai Jiapu, the foreign ministry.
Yes.
And yes, he's now being sidelined, so to speak. So Mr. Lu, he obviously, now that the Sino-French relationship seems to be improved, at least for the time being, and we'll see how long that lasts, because we may have wait till the next crisis. But his presence certainly doesn't help a smooth communication and dialogue. And it doesn't help business neither, because actually Sino-French business, contrary to what has been written and said very wrongly, is not in good shape. The so-called business deals that came out of the Macron trip are just not real. There have been very few, just Airbus, that's been mainly.
Can you say more about that?
Yes.
Why is the private sector concerned about doing more in China? What is
absolutely. I mean, you've seen many companies from around the world rethinking their Chinese strategy, and that includes the French multinationals. Many of them have reduced their exposure to China. You had companies like Carrefour or Auchan who basically left China. And then, of course, you have the case of Airbus, which has been, of course, in high fashion, mainly because Boeing is not. And you only have two suppliers of civilian aircrafts. And now that, eventually maybe China will come up with its own aircraft, but China just has no choice. And of course, France relies a lot on its space and aviation industry. But apart from that, apart from luxury products and a few other things, cosmetics, agribusiness, it's honestly, the trade deficits is in China's favor, of course. 40 billion euro, that would be about $45 billion for last year. And it's becoming more and more serious every year. So I think it's going to be difficult to get back to a normal a trade relationship, and also in terms of investments. Unlike the Germans, who have a different strategy, the French have not been investing very much in China, and I don't think the Macron visit will change that. So again, I think the visit was somewhat wrongly perceived.
Yeah.
It was more of a political visit than a business trip.
It sounds like for China to regain the confidence of French investors and business sector, it may take a while. Well, lastly, obviously the most pressing issue continues to be the Ukraine-Russia war for European countries. And would you say you think that will continue to dominate EU's diplomacy with China and the US for just the next, 6-12 months?
So everybody hopes this war will come to an end, but I think Vladimir Putin is a man who obviously has no, feelings about all this. He thinks, this is his duty to take back Ukraine. He thinks Ukraine is almost like an insult to the Russian nation, and China, for reasons that are well known, doesn't want to let down his friend Vladimir Putin. But at the same time, it is not possible for the Chinese leadership to sacrifice the relationship with European countries, which are also European markets, especially at the time when the US-China relationship has become so bad. And so, and the prospect of it is also very gloomy. So I think, we'll have to sit down around the table at some point. I don't know whether China will really help, but I think there's been a move from China towards Europeans, particularly towards the French, to try to engage in some kind of mediation. Now, China doesn't have a great background as a mediator. That will be a new role, especially in Europe. So I don't think we'll even call it a mediation, but at least China is willing to play to play a positive role in this, and to perhaps improve its image, which has not been very good recently.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I mean, clearly it's a very complicated world right now, and EU, European countries, and France will continue to play a very important role. So thank you for speaking to TVBS Meeting Room, and take care.
Thank you.